Hello there, welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. And in this episode, we're joined by Sarah Woods, the Deputy Chief Executive of the UK charity Help Musicians, which offers career help for musicians in the form of a number of services, including financial support. We'll be talking about what she calls the reverse globalisation of the music industry, a situation where UK artists become confined to touring in the UK due to it becoming increasingly hard to tour abroad. Now, each Music Ally Focus episode analyses one meaningful music business story at a time, just like this one. And so this podcast is going to be focused and thus quick. It will take the same amount of time as Patrick Bertoletti could hypothetically peel and eat 200 bananas. Patrick peeled and ate 8 bananas in 1 minute in 2012. A record that feels like it should be easy to break, but probably isn't. Now, talking of banana skins, international touring is, for many UK artists today, a slippery proposition. Post-Brexit, touring the rest of Europe is now a complex affair involving visas and carnets and accompanying rising costs. As a result, some musicians from the UK have been looking instead to America and are now finding complications there too, with the US planning to raise touring visa fees for foreign acts by more than 250%. So we spoke to Sarah about this reverse globalisation, as she calls it, and she shared some data that shows where applicants to Help Musicians services most need help around touring, what the impacts might mean for artists as they seek to expand their audience at home and abroad under these conditions. Let's go over to Sarah now. So I'm very happy to welcome to the podcast Help Musicians Deputy Chief Executive, Sarah Woods. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. First of all, can you introduce yourself and sort of tell us what you do at Help Musicians and what Help Musicians does?
Of course. So I am the Deputy Chief Executive at Help Musicians, and we support musicians right across the UK in times of crisis and in opportunity. And we offer a really broad range of help, from health and welfare support, business advice, mentoring, funding to support touring and new music. And we also offer a number of helplines to help musicians navigate bullying and harassment. And we also finally have a charity called Music Minds Matter that supports the mental health of everyone who works in the music industry.
Yeah, a very comprehensive suite of services, and people can visit, I think it's helpmusicians.org.uk to
That's it. Go and have a look.
Yes, good. Now, one of the things you mentioned there was the touring element. And obviously what you're speaking about there is a sort of suite of services covering everything from mental health to tour support for people who need it for various reasons. So that means obviously you're talking to a lot of people, artists, who are touring or perhaps trying to tour. And obviously one of the obstacles they must be facing is the sort of, for example, the financial realities of touring. It's been a very changed marketplace recently, particularly since COVID. So what, from your perspective then, what is the state of affairs for touring artists? You know, we're talking about UK touring artists, but this can apply to lots of different people from different places. So what's the state of affairs at the moment, and what are the challenges right now?
Sure. So I think the starting position is that musicians can no longer work and travel freely as they did before Brexit. Musicians now need to actively engage in all kinds of issues such as visas, work permits, carnets, issues to do with merchandise, cabotage restrictions. So the whole landscape for musicians thinking about touring has got a lot more complex. In addition to that, EU member states have different rules which you need to consider when planning a tour and thinking about the movement of goods. And the risk for musicians is that, you know, you get your paperwork wrong, you might be stopped at the border. Tours who are already potentially marginal in terms of profit, are more risky given the number of things you need to navigate and potentially things that can go wrong. And I think for musicians who are freelance, potentially without large teams around them, the burden of managing all of that, carnets, paperwork, also adds to cost, it adds to risk, and it adds to stress actually when you are trying to do all of that yourself. It's a very much changed landscape, and one which I think for musicians is much more difficult to navigate.
Yeah. And we've heard stories recently about artists, for example, saying they're cancelling tours and they can't in Europe. They just can't make the finances work. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because we've moved on from this sort of assumed idea from a few years ago that musicians are making all their money from touring and they're not making anything from streaming. And now we've moved to a reality where musicians are saying, actually, I can't make the numbers work from touring either. I'm not asking you to drop anyone in it here, but is there, having known people who are in bands for a long time, I can imagine some of them would say, we're just going to go anyway and see if we can get away with it. Is the reality that isn't working? That it really is just too hard to... I'm not condoning this as an approach, but I'm just imagining the mind of some artists I can think of. It really is that difficult for them.
Well, I think it depends on, I think it depends on the nature of the artist. So, we've seen Little Sims cancel. We've seen a number of artists cancel due to costs. And I think this is also happening at a time when, audiences aren't quite back the way they were. So petrol costs, transport, accommodations gone off. So, there are a number of things here which I think mean that the touring landscape is more risky. I think for some artists, potentially they chose to tour even if it was going to be marginal for them anyway in terms of career development. I was reading the UK Music report this morning for 2022, and there's a frightening stat in there that in 2020, they think a third of the workforce left the profession, and that was mainly freelance musicians. So I think his life is just getting tougher, and it's tougher to get into things which support career development and potentially trying to make a profit from them. And I think, all those issues around Brexit are really going to be, very in the forefront of a musician's mind to think about, do I risk this? Do I take this step in terms of my career development or not? Yeah.
Something interesting there you mentioned about artists cancelling is, one of the things is that people were sometimes doing tours when they didn't really want to. They were doing too many shows than they would prefer to do. And of course, in life, we all have to do things we don't want to do. But this is perhaps something that was out of balance before. So are artists saying... What are they saying? Are they saying, okay, I'm actually kind of okay that I'm not doing this? Or are they saying that actually I really wish I was and I can't? Or where does that sit, really?
So we have a Touring and Live fund that we launched a year ago to, coming out of the pandemic, help musicians, start to rebuild their careers. And we've put more money into that this year. That will be a £500,000 fund to support musicians to invest in Touring and Live. What we're seeing in that is actually so many of the applications are for UK tours. 8% of applications apply for EU tour, 6% for US, and we've seen 15% increase in the number of applications for that. So if I just take that insight, then musicians are still touring in the EU. Whether 8%, if we'd done that a year ago, would have been more or less, I can't tell you. Interestingly, when I think about session musicians, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying, they are seeing artists take less band members on tour with them, potentially filling that talent from a local market. And that's potentially worrying as well, because, it's not just about the major artists, but it's about the freelance musicians and their availability to find work and sustain a career as well.
Yeah, and of course, perhaps has an impact on selling your merchandise and things like that. You're directing people via QR code to an online store instead of taking things with you, which has a completely different bearing on what you do, and is another complication. You've mentioned this concept of something you've called a reverse globalisation of the music industry.
Yeah.
Where artists perhaps are looking closer to home. And what can you explain that concept from the perspective of a UK artist then?
Sure. So, digital development has opened up new markets to musicians. Potentially changes to the EU, threat of increased visa costs for US tours. I think, if I was a musician, I think that the ability to tour and build relationships within those markets, as you've just said, either from in-person sales, is more challenging. So I think musicians feel that their ability to connect with audiences and drive a sustainable career is harder than it used to be. But I don't think it's just about the ability to earn. I think it's about the ability to build profile and an audience base. In order to progress sustainable careers. And also for musicians, standing in the UK's music across Europe. Potentially, if there is a decline that we're seeing as a result of the issues we've talked about, then that could have quite a long-term impact for music in the UK.
And what about sort of within the UK then? We're talking here about the sort of hop over the English Channel to continental Europe. But I mean, artists, we had this very weird period recently, of course, where touring shut down completely. As you said, a lot of people left the industry. It's drained talent out, and now it's kind of rebuilding again. There was that glut of shows for a period, and now we're sort of reaching perhaps some sort of equilibrium again. I noted today on, I think it was the DJ, the British DJ Steve Lamacq, BBC DJ, shared some statistics that one live venue a week is closing in the UK, which is kind of worrying. So what's the reality of that landscape then? So let's say I'm an artist and I'm saying, okay, maybe I'm going to put touring on the countries in the EU, going to France or Spain or whatever, on hold for a while. I'll focus on the home market. If that reverse globalisation thing comes into play, even for a percentage of people, but then what's the reality when they hit the road in the UK then? What are the challenges there that you're seeing?
Well, in terms of applications, where people are applying for EU in terms of that touring and live fund, often they're applying for help with some of the costs associated with touring that weren't there before. So, applications for carnets, help with those kind of things, which weren't there before. One of the things I was talking to our head of musicians development the other day, who runs this area, and she was saying that musicians are often asking for help to fund support acts, actually, whether in the UK. So my takeaway from those kind of things are that the kind of margins around touring are really, really tight. So they're applying to a charity to help, get that tour off into a slightly more financially secure footing. But if that's happening at scale, then potentially that's quite worrying. And if more artists are trying to perform in the UK, and as you've just said, there are potentially, hopefully not, but less venues over time, then that's an incredibly crowded market for the artist to be trying to build a sustainable career in. A lot of artists are talking about how they derive more income from merchandise. We're seeing a lot of that on our business advice. So a lot of our business advisors are getting asked to, how can I make more money out of my business? So how do I get a kind of multi-stream income model from my creativity? And that's becoming more and more of a trend that we're seeing on that side too.
Interesting. And touring the UK has never been, for emerging artists, has never been an easy task in terms of making money. It's always been a very marginal decision. But as you say, what could the chilling effects of that be? Let's assume that hopefully not many more venues do close, but if there is a sort of, as you say, an overcrowded market, what are perhaps the long-term impacts of that we're not thinking of at the moment? It means perhaps there's too many bands to play too few venues. Yeah. But what is the knock-on effect in terms of development, perhaps, of artists or other things?
It's a really good question. I think, look, time will tell in terms of whether, musicians give up because it's too hard, whether they give up because they can't get the dates, in terms of venues, whether there aren't enough venues. There's potentially a psychological impact too on all of this, which is it's hard making a living as a musician. We've seen in the last 2 years, Music Minds Matter, our mental health service, calls to that are up 200%. So musicians have done a really good job during the pandemic to try and keep going. But my worry is that musicians will think this is just too hard. And one of the things that musicians, I think, do get at the moment from that interaction with the audience is, the fans really showing them what a difference that in-person experience makes. So, the danger is psychologically over time, if that diminishes to more musicians who maybe are doing okay in terms of streaming sales, but miss that interaction with the fans and start to think, is this too difficult? I certainly hope not. But what we've seen in terms of psychological impact, is a real challenge at the moment.
Interesting. So let's look a little bit further afield then. The sort of classic, if you like, progress for an artist touring is to tour the UK, maybe branch out to Europe. Germany was always a lucrative, a slightly more lucrative touring market, I seem to remember. And then at some point maybe look to get some shows going in the US. And now the US is obviously a completely different monster when it comes to touring anyway, because of the size and the scale of it and what needs to be done. But it was always something, and remains something, that is on the horizon for artists in an artist development way, and also as a sort of ambition. But what is the reality of that as an option then at the moment? If artists might be saying, well, I can't, the EU is a bit tough, maybe I'll look on the other side of the ocean and go that way towards America instead.
Yeah. So I think, the benefit of the US is a really large potential market. There aren't language barriers. There are many styles of music in common. And, potentially artists can navigate the challenges associated with touring in the US. The suggestion of a 250% increase in touring visa fees, I think, is going to be tough. And I think
this is recent, isn't it? This is still sort of not fully resolved.
So there are proposals at the moment, and various organisations within the music industry have quite rightly, put forward views on the potential impact of that, and I think that's quite right. So I think a decision is due on that shortly. So I think right now, if you're a musician and you think about navigating Europe, you may well think, well, is America a better market for me, given some of those benefits? I think if that 250% visa increase comes in, that's going to get tougher. So in terms of reverse globalisation, I think, musicians have got more markets from kind of digital reach. But in terms of ability to build fans across the world, things are getting tougher.
And are there any knock-on effects of this potential increase of the visa fees for foreign acts touring the US? We're looking at it from a sort of UK artist perspective, but what other impacts are there if suddenly that sort of is shrinking the pool a bit of artists who are going to the US? Because obviously one thing is then that, obviously the top end artists, not a problem. There's budget for this. Yeah. But then there is and we're seeing this in a lot of different areas. We're seeing the spiky end of the long tail. Everything's fine. They're making money. Everything's possible. But then you get as soon as you start to get down to the middle of the long tail, things get more tough. So what sort of consequences might we see as a result of that?
Well, I mean, it's not just the costs. I think one of the challenges with all of these things is whether musicians are able to work as flexibly as they could before. That ability to be offered a gig at the last minute if you're a session musician. But all of that red tape means that people need to plan ahead more. So I think it's difficult to predict what is a combination of a number of issues that maybe are coming together to be a bit of a concerning melting pot. But I don't think certainly that's good news. I think it will exacerbate some of the issues that we've seen in terms of rising costs in the UK, in terms of Europe, just further.
So let's move the attention back a little bit to help musicians then. You outlined at the start the kind of services that you offer and the help that you offer to musicians. But with regards to this issue and the ones that are sort of around it, because as you said, mental health is connected to the stresses and strains of touring as well. So what are you doing in this area, and how will you know that what Help Musicians is doing is a success?
So we've got a broad range of support, but specifically in this area, we've got a helpline called Viva La Visa that is available to anybody who's thinking about planning a tour and offers 30 minutes of one-to-one tailored advice to give people clarity on visas or work permits, passports, or anything that they want to ask about in terms of thinking. So please do use that. It's a service available to anybody in the music industry, and it's available now. And people are calling that and asking lots of questions about visa requirements, carnets for the EU. 53% of all calls to that are for the EU, showing hopefully that helpline is offering some benefit to help navigate those issues. And then I mentioned earlier our touring and live fund. So if you're a musician that's thinking about touring, you can apply for support from Help Musicians, and that will be for a grant that goes towards your tour, but also offers you 6 hours of one-to-one business advice with a music industry professional as well, to help you hopefully make the most of the opportunity from that tour, or any other questions that you've got about your business. So I'd encourage anybody that's listening to this to have a look at our website and look at those services, because hopefully they will help people navigate some of the challenges they're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, I'll put links to those things you just mentioned beneath the podcast, so people can click straight through. So artists can apply for funding.
They can.
I presume they have to submit some sort of business plan or something, but then that can be spent on everything that allows the tour to happen, including, you were mentioning, sort of bringing people along and funding musicians to tour and things like that.
Yeah, so, there's up to £5,000 that someone can apply for. And we ask people to put forward what the costs are associated with that tour, specifically what the funding would be to go towards. And there's a wide range of support elements that we would fund. Most frequent requests at the moment are accommodation, travel, subsistence. But yes, do look at that support and see how it might help you. There are some things that we won't fund. I won't go into that. It's in the kind of eligibility criteria. But we give quite a lot of advice around that. So please do look at that, as I'm sure there's something in there that if you're planning a tour, we can support you with.
Yeah, maybe a potential business opportunity for anyone who enjoys filling in visa applications and carnets and things like that. That you could, you could have a spin-off business helping artists go and tour. I'm sure that must be a thing as well. I don't know. Like you say, it's a bit of a minefield of regulations. Every country is different, so
yeah.
And any kind of support from you or people is good, right?
Yeah, and that's what Viva La Visa do. So, there are people there who are experts in this, who understand all of the different rules to do with different EU member states, and can really give you proper advice, particularly if you're planning a tour that's got multiple stops.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, like I say, I'll put some links to those things beneath the podcast, and people can check it out and get in touch as they see fit. Especially, I'm sure that there are plenty of musicians listening who are interested in the support you're providing, potentially the money as well. Before you go, one final question, which I've been asking everyone for context, which is, if you could only choose one piece of music to take with you as you journey through the rest of your life, maybe touring or not, what would it be? It could be an album or a song. I don't really mind.
Oh, great question. Great question. Yeah. I've got two that I can't choose between. So I'm going to be
tell us both. And
I'm going to be greedy.
I'll let the listeners decide.
Thank you. First one is Disintegration by The Cure. At a certain point in my life, when I was a bit of a goth, that was particularly
a goth.
It's particularly memorable for me. And I trained as a cellist, and I remember listening to the Elgar Cello Concerto by Jacqueline Dupre at a certain point in my life. And I was really not motivated to practice as a kid, but it was the one thing that made me think one day maybe I'd be as good as that. But never. Didn't quite get there.
You set a high standard from the beginning, which I admire your ambition.
Thank you.
But two good choices, and I will link to those beneath the podcast as well. So we can really get a full contextual snapshot of your life.
Thank you.
Okay. So Sarah Woods of Help Musicians, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Joe.
And a big thanks again to Sarah. There are links peppered beneath the podcast so you can click through to all of the things that she mentioned, including financial support and other support services from Help Musicians. And if you found that useful, please share the podcast on with someone else who you think will get something out of it. And please, as ever, do email me. It's joe@musically.com. That's Joe, Joe, @musically.com with any feedback or suggestions or anything else, really. I'm happy to always hear from you. We have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, which rounds up bits and pieces of the best analysis, news, marketing insight, and skills from Music Ally's wide suite of services. So do sign up and, impress your friends. Links are in the description, as always. So that's it. Thanks for joining us here on the Music Ally Focus. As ever, I've been Joe Sparrow, and see you soon.